right. Well, welcome everybody to a special Just the Basics CLE. I'm Dave Summers, Executive Director of the Omaha Bar Association, and I am here today with Professor Jack Beard of UNL College of Law. Hello, Professor.
Hello, good morning.
For those watching, we're doing this in real time on noon on I believe it's Wednesday today or Tuesday today, and we're going to have this on demand for 2 years. So if they're not watching this live, you can get CLE credit for contacting the Omaha Bar Association. So I wanted to get that out of the way first because people always want to know where they get their CLE credit. But we are here today, and let me do my share screen here. Right. We are here today for the Just the Basics on Space Law. And some of you are being like, is that a real thing? Yes, it is a real thing. Professor Beard's here to tell us about it. It's going to be an hour-long CLE presentation. And I really want to thank the Nebraska College of Law for putting this on with us. They have been great to work with over the years. I've had staff members actually on the virtual chats here recently, and so I just want to give a shout out to the Nebraska College of Law for setting this up, and
thank you,
Professor Beard, for being here. Thank you. For those just interested in how the heck we came to this point in time where we're talking about space law, I'm just gonna say for the record, I have a soft place in my heart for Georgetown because I'm an undergrad graduate of the undergrad college, and Tony Arend, who came in to speak a few years ago at a OBA CLE on North Korean international law at the start of the Trump administration. He sat me down. We went to the fall kickoff barbecue, which unfortunately is not happening next month. Sorry, the hundreds and hundreds of attorneys and judges who usually attend that. But we're sitting down. He said, "You know who you need to have come talk to the Omaha Bar Association is Jack Beard. He's down at Lincoln. He runs the space law program. And he's actually a close friend and graduate Georgetown. That's Georgetown undergrad, Georgetown Law School grad. And so many years later, we are now sitting down to do this lecture with Professor Beard. So it's been a little bit delayed, and I apologize, Professor, for that. But thank you so much for joining us today and doing a basics. And I know that there's whole courses that you teach on this. You teach national securities law, you teach space law, you teach international law that intersects with the space law. You have a CV that's a mile long, and it's very impressive.
You don't need to go over any of it. No one wants to hear.
but I think what's important to know is that you are ex-JAG. You've worked for the Department of Defense. You've taught for many years in academia on both coasts and now in the best coast, the middle coast. And so I'm not going to stand up here any longer or virtually stand up here any longer. I'm going to turn it over to you. And if anybody has any questions, I am happy to jump in at the end and feed them to Professor Beard and have him answer them at the end of the hour. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Dave. Yes, it's true. I am now here in Nebraska. I served 5 secretaries of defense in the Office of Secretary of Defense and General Counsel. I did the international agreements for various administrations, Republicans and Democrats. I went to teach at UCLA School of Law and came here to Nebraska 9 years ago. A wonderful place to live, and Omaha, probably the most wonderful 1 million person city I've ever seen in the world. So I'm delighted to be here with you today. I am the co-director of the Space, Cyber, and Telecom Law program at the University of Nebraska College of Law. And I have a really great privilege there in training students to head off to wonderful work in the 3 different sectors of space law. I'm going to talk a bit about commercial, which you are seeing explode. Fortunately, that's just figuratively explode across the country here, and business is booming. The civil side and the military side. I send JD students who get a concentration in this area to go work in the commercial field. So I have graduates, for instance, in the General Counsel's Office at SpaceX. On the civil front, I have students in the US government agencies that I like to communicate with now and then. And we'll talk about the civil administration and civil practice in space law. And then my principal specialty, the military side. Nebraska educates students from all over the world to getting an LLM in space and cyber law. And the US military entrusts us, Marine Corps, Air Force, Navy, Army, with their JAG officers to get an LLM in space and cyber law. And so it's exciting for me to see my graduates working in Spacecom and now in Space Force and in the Pentagon working for the different branches on space law. And no important agency of the government that does any international work is going to be complete without several people, at least a few, working on space law issues. So anyway, without further ado, let's just recap the commercial side. To say you work in space law on the commercial side may not be a whole lot like anybody else's work. The companies that do the work need every sort of business done. They need contracts done. They need administrative matters handled. They need personnel and contract problems handled, and procurement rather. But what is happening now is amazing. In the old days, there used to just be one launch company, and they would successfully launch Atlas and Delta rockets, and everybody applauded, and they were successful. But now there's happily so much more competition. The United Launch Alliance, Boeing and Lockheed, has been the old grandpa of this field. And to their credit, they've had now 120 consecutive successful launches, which is remarkable when you look at countries trying to do this. The Chinese have a great program, but they lose a lot of ships on blast off. They had a failure here recently. ULA's record is amazing. Anyway, they're building the new Vulcan Centaur, and of course, Blue Origin and their New Glenn rocket, and Jeff Bezos are doing their thing. Northrop Grumman building the Omega rocket, and of course SpaceX with their Falcon and Heavy Falcon rockets. So in addition to all of this competition for the massive, expensive rockets that do the launching, you're also following the business of SpaceX with its Dragon capsule, first launch of Americans from American territory in 10 years, no longer relying on Russians and Russian vessels to get us there. The Dragon capsule successfully docked. NASA crew did their business, came back. You saw them land this Sunday. That's the first landing at sea in 45 years for the United States as a SpaceX crew gathers them up. Not far behind, well, is the amazing story of SpaceX finding ways to reuse their rocket boosters, and those are two of the rocket boosters landing. This dramatically decreases the cost of launching things into space, and it's one of the many innovations that SpaceX has brought to the field. Close behind SpaceX is the Boeing Starliner. It was supposed to bring astronauts to the International Space Station even before the Dragon, but it's had a few problems and software glitches, and it's due to be in space next year. You've heard about the Artemis project. There's $1.5 billion worth of stuff going on here now, or directly on the horizon, unless Congress cuts it, because of course the budget and the economy goes completely through the floor. But as it stands now, there's space launch systems being developed. The Orion, a cruise ship that actually takes the astronauts to the moon and beyond, the way it's being built. The Gateway system is a habitation rotating around the moon that can dock with the Orion, and the lunar landers. It's Lockheed Martin that is building the Orion space capsule. Some of them are underway and ready to be launched. And then, of course, there's space tourism. Virgin Galactic's Unity is ready to go. Test flights done. Passengers paying their $250,000 and signing up in competition with Blue Origin's New Shepard. And of course, the New Shepard launches from the ground and comes down in the ground. The reusable the reusable rockets come down, and the capsule itself floats gently back to Earth, hopefully, there in West Texas. So it's an amazing amount of commercial industry going on. And the commercial industry has to work with civil space agencies. And you know about NASA, and they've got all sorts of scientific research and granting of lots of money to encourage lots of space competition and all sorts of space activities going on. They're the primary space agency of the US government. But if you're a lawyer working for one of the companies, you're going to probably be working more with the FAA and the FCC. You're going to need to get licenses from them. For what? Permits, approvals, licenses. Well, you're going to need them for launching and reentry and using the satellite radio frequencies that you may want to use. And that's all due to an international legal requirement flowing from the Outer Space Treaty. We'll talk for a moment about the Outer Space Treaty momentarily. But here in the United States, it is primarily the Office of Space Transportation at the FAA that oversees all this. If you're an American citizen or a foreign national who wants to launch from US territory, you've got to go to the FAA for authorization, and both for the launch and for the reentry. The US could regulate more than it does now, and probably will. But right now, it's basically the launch and reentry authorizations. It's required to do so on an unprecedented legal scale by space law. Space law has, as I'll talk about here in a moment, a unique provision that makes the US government completely responsible in space for non-governmental actors that are connected with that country. But your launch permission, to go back to this, your launch permission involves dealing with the potential harm right now that you might cause. Again, this is all the US government's asking for right now. You've got to be responsible for all that falling debris. You've got to be responsible for, of course, an environmental protection statement and what you're going to do to the lizards. And so, yes, I know some of you out there thinking that that Space Force thing is pretty funny. I have to admit it is, and especially the part asking, you know, oh, space attorney, get out of here. No, I'll do a shout out for Space Force here in a moment. Yes, you got to track the lizards down, all right? To get the launch license, though, one of the biggies is you've got to establish financial responsibility if your rocket veers off course and blows up Miami, right? That's a really important point to get the license. So you're going to have to go to a space insurer to get that. But you've also going to have to go to the FCC in all likelihood to use the communications frequencies that you want. But back to the insurance problem. I always enjoy, I do enjoy the Outer Space Treaty, but I particularly enjoy commercial third-party liability problems. I love to talk to the space insurers. They're a kind of dark crowd. Business is good because there have been no horrible accidents. When there are, prices will go up, so insurance is pretty cheap. But when the launch licensee goes to get their insurance, they've got the US government helping them out. They need to calculate their maximum probable loss, which is usually between $50 and $100 million. And you've got to be responsible for that with their insurer. Beyond that, your United States government indemnifies them up to $2.8 billion. And everybody loves this law, especially the space companies. And we attract business from all over the world to launch from the United States, which is a good thing, and encourage different companies to launch. And in part, they rely on this language. Although clever, shrewd lawyers that you are, if you read the statute, really all it does is promise that the administration will ask Congress for the appropriation. Now, at least they're obligated to ask Congress, but it's up to Congress whether they're going to pay that additional up to $2.8 billion. Anyway, after it exceeds that, liability goes back to the operator and bankrupts them, no doubt. But this is the liability regime. Again, you got to have this given the way the Outer Space Treaty regulates the business of outer space. I'm going in reverse, forgive me. So this is the foundational document. It's only about 2,200 words, but it is the Constitution, the Magna Carta of space law. And you may not be familiar with it in all likelihood. but almost everyone working in all these offices knows something about it. And depending on your particular field, you need to know quite a lot about it. It's not actually called the Outer Space Treaty. It's actually the treaty governing principles governing activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. It doesn't just govern outer space. It also governs things on the moon. And remember, if you're a space law attorney, you know moon is always capitalized. When it's our moon, it's capitalized. Important editing material there for you. Anyway, there are aspects of the Outer Space Treaty that directly address activities on the moon, but please don't confuse this with the Moon Treaty, which practically no one has signed. Speaking of that, there are technically 5 space law agreements, but really only 4. The Rescue and Return Agreement, the Liability Treaty, and the Registration Treaty all implement provisions of the Outer Space Treaty. Liability is an interesting issue. Talk about that in a moment. Registration, you've got to, if you're the launching state, you've got to register that satellite or space object. And then you have the benefit of exercising jurisdiction and control over that space object. So don't get excited if someone on the US registered spaceship hacks into their ex-spouse's email on Earth. Don't worry about what law applies, because in all likelihood, it's going to be the United States law. Michigan or Florida law, a little more complicated, and also complicated on the International Space Station, because different portions of that space station have different countries' laws governing it. If you are really into space law, your civil procedure jurisdiction, that just gave you the beginning of understanding how a very different system would set this up. And it is a lot of fun. Conflicts of law and jurisdiction are great things in space. You're guided by these treaties. The Moon Treaty, as I said, only has 18 states that signed up to it. It's not really relevant to international law unless you are in Kazakhstan or Mexico or the Philippines or Morocco. There's 18 countries. None of them are major spacefaring states. And it also very much affects who owns the property, who owns the resources you might take from some asteroid and bring back to Earth. It has a sort of apportionment sharing provision, which a lot of countries don't want to be party to, including the United States. Anyway, so one of the most important articles of the Outer Space Treaty, which is really mind-boggling, actually, is that everything in space is the responsibility of some government. States bear international responsibility for activities in outer space, whether they're carried out by governmental entities, agencies, or non-governmental agencies. So this makes a direct connection between the activities of these companies and the United States government and its responsibility. It further requires that states have to continually supervise and require authorization from these. Authorization is required from the state for these private companies to be operating. This causes all sorts of interesting problems you will never find on Earth. And this is not something that the United States is used to, because of course we like to separate out corporate matters from the government. It's a little bit more of a joint venture with space, with some interesting complications. Responsibility is to be distinguished under the Outer Space Treaty from the term liability. Liability refers to the damage one of your space objects does to another country's space objects or any other space object. And also the damage you cause back here on Earth when it crashes. This is a treaty regime established for this particular aspect of liability. It's pretty much strict liability when your object crashes onto Earth and causes damage, more of an issue of fault with respect to collisions in space. But at this point, I have to step back and note that if you are working in this area, in space law, especially on the military side, where these issues, there are military aspects to all of these different provisions, the legal regime, the discipline that you have to be well versed in is treaty law and treaty interpretation. Don't fool yourself. There's just about nothing in contract law that's similar to treaty law. Treaty law is its own specialized area of law. And in fact, there is a treaty that sets forth the rules for that, called the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And those of us that work in the government or did work in the government and continue to work with the government know that there are certain aspects of interpreting treaties that really come to bear that you would never find in contract law. One in particular is the way the parties to the agreement implement these agreements and the ambiguous terms. How do the countries implement? You're seeing some of this play out in military activities in space, with some countries starting to complain about things other countries are doing. The French in particular have gotten very belligerent here lately about Russian satellites getting too close. And there's a bit of a dance going on under the terms of the treaty. And the question is, are you going to invoke the treaty and its terms and say this is indeed a violation? Understanding that if you do that, the other side's going to do the same thing to you when you engage in that activity. It's really quite an interesting field. But back to interesting problems, and we'll do some more of the treaty here in a moment. I have a final problem for your consideration. You may not know it, but the Department of Commerce is a major player in space. That's because a senator didn't want the FAA to have these responsibilities and transferred a lot of them when it went through Congress to the Department of Commerce. Among their duties, of course, NOAA is also part of the Commerce Department. Lots of weather satellites governed by NOAA and part of Commerce Department. The Commerce Department has been asked to take up responsibility for two critical, interesting areas: space situational awareness and space traffic management. Companies are dying to get information about things that are going to collide with their satellites. They're very interested in space debris that's going to hit them. Could there be a government or international agency providing information to help with the space traffic management, to help them be aware of the things in their environment that they've got to pass through? Well, there are some private companies that are taking this up. They can track a lot of things in space. They can share that information with companies. But the US government has ever-growing resources for tracking things. And the question is, when do companies get alerted of a near collision or something like that? Commerce Department is currently tracking 20,000 objects that are a softball size or more in space. You know, toothbrushes, wrenches, gloves are floating around out there. But at 17,000 miles an hour, most of them are capable of destroying a satellite. Yes, space debris is a growing problem. In low Earth orbit, they're traveling at 17,000 miles per hour, which is fast enough to destroy almost any satellite. If you're talking about something as big as a softball. There are over 500,000 pieces of debris the size of a marble. Our ability to track these things gets better and better. Once in a while, the International Space Station has to maneuver to miss some of these things. And every launch generates some amount of debris. There are efforts underway to mitigate the debris creation. And of course, in low Earth orbit, its orbit may erode and the stuff may burn up in the atmosphere in a few months or a year. But the further out you go, the more likely it is that you're creating a belt of debris that spaceships have to travel through that could be there for centuries. One of the interesting problems of space. The debris increases, and if it keeps on increasing, there's possibilities of it cascading when the stuff hits into each other and nobody being able to use space. People, trust me, lots of people are working on it, and government agencies are questioning how much they're going to do for private industry in this area. It's time for national security and space law. My primary field in this area of space law at Nebraska. Well, so to begin with, the Outer Space Treaty has quite a few interesting arms control provisions about, for instance, weapons of mass destruction going in orbit or being placed on the moon. And it has some specific restrictions on military activities on the moon, but it leaves an awfully lot open for military forces, military space operations. We're completely dependent on space as a country for our national defense in ways that you might not even be aware of. But before I even get to that, let me go ahead and deal with your laughs, right? Yes, Space Force, ha, 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 you're saying. Now, understand that from the late 1990s to now, our basic space policies haven't changed since the Rumsfeld Commission in 2001. No, excuse me. Rumsfeld Commission is even earlier than that, but it establishes around 2000 the wonderful world of we've got to protect our assets in space. The Space Force is just another event, another episode, and more renewed emphasis on this issue, a new organization, but it's the same story. And in terms of the organization, the Space Force, and now the Unified Space Command, Space Force is part of the Air Force, Unified Space Command are all of the services contributing to this command. Um, it wasn't even created by President Trump, although he is associated most with it. Congress has been pushing for this strongly for some time and found a patron in President Trump. And now we have the Space Force. Yes, you're going to make fun of it, probably. You're going to talk to me about Steve Carell and the funny things on Space Force, a great Netflix piece. And then you might also say, hey, Professor Beard, you're working with these people, and I'm always working with them. What about their silly uniforms? What does this camouflage in space? Yes, I admit it doesn't camouflage anything in space, but give the Space Force a break. These uniforms are cheap, okay? They're already off, pull them off the shelf, put a Space Force patch on them, save the taxpayer a lot of money as you build a new sixth service, right? So give them a little break on that. After all, that is funny camouflage, right? If you think about it. Of course, credit to Steve Carell and Space Force. If only we were equipping our soldiers with Space Force uniforms like that. Also, I see some laughter out there about the Space Force emblem looking an awfully lot like Starfleet Command. Yeah, there are definite similarities there, but what you don't know is that even before the series Star Trek appeared in 1966, in 1961, there was the Air Force Space Command. Arguably, that was used by, we will never know, but it sure looks like Star Trek borrowed some of the Air Force Space Command. So, let's not be too harsh with Space Force. They get enough jokes sent their way. I will say that the U.S. Space Command and the United States Air Force Academy have a wonderful webinar underway every month on space law issues. It's free to everyone to tune in if you're interested. The next one's on September 30th. You can post that if you'd like to join. The next webinar is co-hosted by me and Lieutenant Commander at the U.S. Space Command on the issue of zones, which I'll mention briefly here as well. Anyway, Space Force, Colorado Springs, not a bad place to be. The epicenter of space industry and defense, military, national security space is Colorado Springs, where many of the major commands are located. Okay, enough of Space Force jokes. U.S. military operations are just completely dependent on space. Otherwise, you're back in, World War II sort of situations. To begin with, all the global communications that matter depend on the satellites. So those nifty little drones you see maneuvering around and doing all of our business in the Middle East operate by virtue of, yes, satellite relays from bases outside Las Vegas or outside McLean, Virginia. The global communications essential not just for talking, but for sending signals to things like drones. GPS services, positioning, navigation, timing services. Bombs can't find their target if it's a GPS guided bomb without the satellites. Tanks can't make their way through the desert, and ships have a lot of trouble with their navigation. The weather matters for all sorts of military operations, environmental monitoring, satellites, the critical world of space-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, three different branches on three different fields when it comes to watching things on Earth and your adversary, and let alone, arguably, the crown jewels, the warning services for combatant commanders. As we speak, satellites are positioned, Russian satellites are positioned over Nebraska looking down. Our satellites are positioned over Russian launch areas looking down to prevent the possibility of an early strike, a strike to incapacitate the other side. And this sort of a first strike is defeated in theory by early warning systems, along with all sorts of other warning services provided to the commanders. So you lose these things, you lose most of America's major advantages in military affairs and military operations. And yet, these satellites, they're so fragile, they're so vulnerable. It's so expensive to send something into space. You can see all sorts of different estimates from $10,000 a pound to $47,000 a pound to even more. And it depends on how you calculate it. But the bottom line is, the heavier it is, the more expensive it is to send something into space. And that becomes a huge issue. If it's basically made of the equivalent of aluminum foil and light, it's going to be able to be damaged pretty easily. And putting armor on it's not going to help you. The armor is too expensive to launch, and the things hitting it are traveling at too great a speed. At 17,000 miles an hour, there's no armor that's going to help you out. Also, they have incredibly predictable orbits. That's why they're a satellite. So the folks down below have a pretty good idea of exactly when it's going to come by, and if they want to hit it with something, they know where it's going to be. There's also the reality that you can't camouflage them. You can't paint them black, right? That'd be Space Force camouflage. No, there's things called radar that make that not possible. And there's no such thing as a stealth satellite yet, although the government spent millions and millions of dollars trying to come up with some way to make a stealth satellite. It hasn't happened yet. And again, weak passive defenses. Your best defense is probably to dodge something, but that takes fuel, and fuel is heavy, and fuel can only be used so many times. And if you dodge enough things, you're going to be running out of fuel. It's very hard to create sturdy, robust defenses for these satellites. There are measures out there. One of the most popular are building very small satellites that work in constellations to perform the functions that some of the big satellites do, but that doesn't work for everything. Meanwhile, this comes to you compliments of your Defense Intelligence Agency. And I send some of my students at Nebraska to be externs at the Defense Intelligence Agency and in the General Counsel's Office at DoD. This comes to me from one of their marvelous brochures, explaining to you the threats the satellites face: high-power microwaves, radio frequency jammers, lasers, robotic mechanisms, kinetic kill vehicles, and chemical spares. Actually, you could also break it down to talk about just co-orbital vehicles that come alongside the satellite, and then the hands reach out and do things. Again, the humorous portrayal of the scissors and Space Force from the Chinese satellite clipping off the fins of the American satellite. Doesn't quite work like that, but robotic mechanisms are real. So are things that might spray the panels and the optical sensors. Remember also, with respect to lasers, we can talk a lot about this, but it's probably not as much law as it is really interesting science fiction turning into the real stuff. You can blind optical lasers, dazzle them, just like a flashlight shining in an optical sensor can do, or you can do worse things to it. There's not a lot of laser activity going on in space between satellites because the power generation for a laser is so substantial that there's not a lot of that going on. But Earth is capable of sending up lasers that affect satellites. And of course, in addition to kinetic energy threats and directed energy threats, there's also cyberspace and mucking with the systems. And it's not just mucking with the satellites, but it's interfering with both the uplink and the downlink. Good old-fashioned electronic jamming can do lots of things in that area. Spoofing to confuse you by giving false signals on GPS is another one, and intercepting encrypted signals and then beaming them back to confuse the satellites that sent the encrypted signals, beaconing, is another thing. There's a lot of electronic interference and jamming going on up and down, even as we speak, with countries stopping satellite broadcasts they don't like. Okay, so I'm going to ask you for a moment to, in our remaining time together, to do a little bit of an exercise here. Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty starts out with a glorious statement that space shall be free for exploration and use by everybody, That includes, doesn't say military is not included in that category. Everybody gets to play, except to the extent through the coming articles that right of free use and access is taken away. Different articles take away that free use and access. If you're looking to go mine an asteroid and you read this article, you might say, golden, I'm ready to go. Get the gold and platinum. Free exploration and use is mine. Of course, you immediately run into Article 2, which tells you that space is not subject to national appropriation. I find a lot of lawyers reduce this to saying you can't exercise sovereignty. It's more than that. It's much more than that. It's prohibiting any appropriation by claim of sovereignty, means of use or occupation, or by any other means. So this is a recurring issue now. If you land on the moon and you start digging up something, and that actually has already happened, but if you're doing it on some commercial scale, you start digging it up, is the soil, is the stuff that you remove a celestial body? Arguably not. It's no longer a resource in place. But even however you legally categorize that soil, what you're standing on is not yours. There's no claim, there's no right to that territory on the moon. And this is one of the complicating factors about upcoming mining operations. And it's not gold. No, it's not platinum. That's not the most valuable thing to get from the moon. Question, see, if this were a class, we could debate this and you could send your questions or your answers in. We'll get to it here in a moment. But one thing you can't do is start selling pieces of the moon. You know, there are companies that somehow get away with doing this, I guess, but I'm not sure that all the people who buy their pieces of the moon recognize it as a gag gift. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, acres of land on the moon are not for sale, but who can own the space resources that you pick up? Well, apparently, US citizens can. Now, you might think that our Congress is ineffective, stagnated, unable to resolve anything or do much of anything. But you'd be wrong if you said that about their joy in approaching space law problems. No. Here's one of their recent pieces of legislation, the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015. And it's got a separate section on asteroid resource and space resource rights, saying that a United States citizen engaged in commercial recovery of an asteroid resource or a space resource under this chapter shall be entitled to any asteroid resource or space resource obtained. That person can possess it, own it, transport, use it, sell it. It's a beautiful thing. In accordance with applicable law and international obligations. Yes, well, our view of that is that, and it's been our view since 1976 through all sorts of administrations, that when the material is removed, it's no longer a celestial body, it's a rock or whatever mineral resource it is. It goes on, the statute, to be more than this. The president is supposed to facilitate commercial exploration and exploitation, discourage government barriers to the development of economically viable, safe commercial industries in space, promote the right of US citizens to engage in commercial exploitation for and commercial recovery of space resources. Now, we're not regulating what companies do right now. The idea is let them go and let free enterprise and capitalism do all these great things in space. You might imagine not everybody agrees with that in the world. And so there's quite a bit of controversy about this approach, but it's not just the United States. Other countries are enacting similar legislation. Ironically, when you land on Earth, though, you'd better be careful which country you land on, because some countries, those 18 that are party to the Moon Treaty, they're not probably going to believe you have the right to possess, own, and sell these things. But what about up in space itself? Well, the US government throws in a disclaimer that, look, nothing in this act allows you to assert sovereignty or exclusive ownership or jurisdiction over anything in space. But, what is ownership, right? And especially also the question of exclusive rights. If you exclude anyone from anything in space, you'd be violating the very first article about everyone having a right to use and explore and have access to space. So a company that goes down and invests the money and time in working on space has a rather interesting problem. They have this right under US law to take these resources and go sell them and so forth. There is a separate provision of the Outer Space Treaty, Article 12, that talks about visiting other countries' space facilities, which is an interesting and now hotly debated article. But back to the story at hand. So you've got US law when you're up there in space. Congratulations. Where does US law apply in space? Well, according to our statutes, it applies on registered US space vehicles, and it generally also follows you, the American citizen, or at least laws that say they apply extraterritorially are now generally interpreted as meaning they apply in outer space as well to US citizens, right? Okay, so anything the US Congress passes that they want to apply extraterritorially, they can also apply to the moon. And so, yay, you've got your little United States code and you're a hunk of platinum and you're a happy person. Unfortunately, who has to obey US law? Who has to comply with it? Nilsya, нет. Ni против русского закона. No, it's not against Russian law. Russian law has its own view of these things, although interestingly, they like to criticize the United States. They're not about to pass a law saying that their citizens can't possess these things as well. But the point is, you might have competing legal systems with respect to these resources. And it's actually worse than the Wild West, because the Wild West was at least on US territory. There is no territorial sovereign here to settle these disputes. And that leads many to suggest that we're going to have to agree to some sort of international governance structure with respect to mining, but it is not here yet. However, what is here is Jeff Bezos. Yes, every time you buy something and have it shipped to you, a little bit of that money goes to this guy to have even more space operations. And he's, of course, extremely envious of Mr. Musk right now. And so he is busy not doing the SpaceX launches. He has been selected by NASA, had this Blue Origin national team with Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, to develop the Artemis human landing system on the moon. And according to Blue Origin, NASA's Artemis program will be the next major milestone in the history of human spaceflight. It's time to go back to the moon, and this time to stay. But if you go back to the moon and stay, what do you need? Well, you're going to need energy, provided in part by sunlight, but you're still going to need something to put in the fuel tank to take off as well. And you're going to need water for humans. How are you going to achieve that? Well, it turns out the most valuable piece of real estate on the moon is the Shackleton crater, or nearby. It's on the South Pole, named after the Antarctic explorer in ancient, well, 1800 times here in the United States. The Shackleton crater is amazing because there are peaks there that are called peaks of eternal light. They essentially are almost always facing the sun. And at the same time, there are craters that experience permanent darkness. And at the bottom of those craters, you find comets and other things that have crashed over the years. And what's left at the bottom of these craters? The most precious of all resources, water. The ice crystals at the bottom of these craters can be mined, and they can be converted into hydrogen for power. For power, it could be a gas station on the moon, and it could also help the happy little inhabitants around the Shackleton crater. This stuff comes to me via NASA, looking at a moon base and how they do it, a resource zone, a habitation zone, an observation zone. They go down and get materials from the crater and finding some way to withstand 300 degrees below Fahrenheit. They'd always be up in the sun. But again, what does this mean about excluding other countries from doing these things? The subject of zones for the military is really interesting too, because you can't really make a zone in peacetime that requires a state to do anything that it doesn't want to do, because if you were to do that, you'd be infringing the First provision of the Outer Space Treaty. Now, you could say if you go in the zone, we're not going to like it and certain things might happen to you, but that's different than saying you've got an obligation. And then the policy side is, even if you establish one of those zones with some kind of warning, you can bet that the other side's going to make the exactly a similar zone, only it's going to be a 200-mile zone instead of a 200-kilometer zone. All these are great questions underway, making space law really interesting stuff. I would like to take up more of the space law issues with you in the Outer Space Treaty, but I'll stick with just the most interesting ones here for your entertainment, and now yield the floor to my good friend and fellow Georgetown alum, Dave Summers. Dave, take it away.
One question is back to satellites and the question of having debris, identifiable debris that's going to hit a satellite, destroy a satellite if it can't get out of the way or what have you. If
Right.
you can, have there been lawsuits associated with that debris? Was from a Russian commercial satellite. It hit an American commercial satellite. We know that they were reckless in how they spun off their debris. And has there been any lawsuit about that or anything?
No, there hasn't been a lawsuit on that, although there have been collisions, and there was one there were two abandoned satellites that just missed each other by less than I think it was something like within the range of like 100 yards or something. And the problem is that hitting debris generates a lot more debris. The Chinese satellite test in 2007, anti-satellite weapons test, generated over 3,000 sizable pieces of debris, which the International Space Station has had to dodge at least once. If you're asking about responsibility for creating space debris, one of the big questions being asked is this whole business of blowing up satellites to show that you're a man and that you can blow up satellites, but you generate a lot of debris. That's a great question that's a good reason to stop those tests and have an international agreement that prohibits it. But up till now, no one has sued the Chinese government for all the debris that's going on up there. There have also been active satellites there have been collisions between them, but we haven't had any debris questions generated yet. So that's still on the books. When debris collisions do cause something awful, I think there'll be a lot more focus on doing some of the international agreements we should be doing right now about stopping these things. In fairness, when the Indians did their anti-satellite test, they tried to make it in the lower Earth orbit so that most of the debris burned up, but you can't control how high some of the debris goes when you have one of these tests. That's a good question, and it will no doubt generate calls for a different legal regime or a new one when something really valuable or human beings are hit by some of the debris. Our mathematical wizards and computers can predict a lot of trajectories and orbits, but many of the satellites, if not most, can't maneuver. So good question. Stand by, I guess, for the next tragedy.
The follow-up, you were talking about insurance for launches, but when the satellites are in space, there is insurance that covers them being destroyed by debris or what have you, or is it you're on your own? We got you up there, you're on your own at that point.
Yeah, this again, a lot of this functions in the weird world where you have a treaty made over 50 years ago, and all sorts of rules and laws, but only recently has space become really congested. And fortunately, we don't have an armed conflict to talk about what that means, but we are going to have more of these accidents that occur along the way. The obligations in space appear to be attached clearly to the United States government. In the liability world, and this is the interesting answer to your question, who exactly is responsible for the liability issues between these crashes? What does the Outer Space Treaty say? It says the launching state is responsible for them. The Outer Space Treaty has 4 definitions of who could be the launching state, but the really grim fact for a state that launches these satellites is that it's pretty well determined now that once you're a launching state, you're always a launching state. So even though France has sold a satellite to Azerbaijan, and they're very proud of it, and the French said, please register it. It's an Azeri satellite, right? That's all good. And the Azeris can sign a document saying, oh, don't worry, anything that we get sued for, we'll take it. We'll take it for you, France. That's a contractual matter. The state that launches is truly the state that remains liable for what happens. And right now, I haven't seen any contracts issued. I haven't seen any launch permits or reentry permits and licenses that go on to talk about the liability in space. There might be out there some scattered stuff on this with respect to some lunar things, but it's an interesting question. And the real question is how much does the United States want to regulate other than your launch license and your reentry license? And I predict in the years ahead, the United States government will have to start regulating more, in part because the Outer Space Treaty says you're supposed to be authorizing and regulating what's going on out there. So good questions. Stand by for answers on that too.
And I guess that comes to the final question, looking ahead. Do you see the major developments happening organically over time as smaller things happen, or do you think that it's going to have to be something as big as international significant armed conflict that brings the world to the table to bang out something that can really have teeth on how to go forward?
Well, I think that the answer may lie there. It's always dangerous to use analogies for space, from air, land, or sea. But if you look at some aspects of space, I think are going to be managed incrementally from below by the space agencies, especially in the area of space traffic management. In the 1960s, if you flew out of an airport, that was the end of radar. And it was assumed that things were going to go okay until you got to another airport radar, until two planes leaving Los Angeles viewing the Grand Canyon collided and killed all those people. And then the idea was maybe there needs to be a little bit more radar coverage for the airplanes. And in fact, the entire airplane industry and air traffic evolved from airports and airline companies and local administrations and airports to get to this much more comprehensive system that we have today. Space traffic management may go down that road. There may be opportunities from below. I'd also note in this regard, there is a group called the Space Debris Mitigation Committee of all the different space agencies, NASA and Roscosmos and the Chinese agency and the European Space Agency. And together they've agreed to standards for the way you make rockets to generate less debris. And it's voluntary, but it ends up being what is put in the codes of all these countries for launch licenses. And so that has effectively driven down the amount of space debris that are generated routinely from launches. And that's, again, working up from the bottom. But a lot of the major stuff to come down from the top and find agreement, there's not going to be that agreement easily found in the world of 2020. The world of 1967 had two major superpowers and most countries lining up behind one of the two. And the deal that was the Outer Space Treaty that was cut was in the interest of those two great powers. If it was done again today, the little countries would have some different things to say, and they will certainly have some different things to say about it now. So I'm afraid that some of it depends on the next disaster in space for the next legal regime, but some of it is slowly making its way up. But I caution everyone, my parting message though to everyone is, space law has to be made by states, not by people writing things, not by Professor Gryffindor or Professor Hufflepuff who's come up with this grand new treatise of how space has got to work. It has to be state practice, and that's why it's worth looking carefully at what states do and what they say as we define these terms. And states will have to get together at some point on solving some of these conflicts. And I think we're looking at something over the next 15 years for something about the moon. There's going to need to be some sort of arrangements worked out on the most valuable property there. It'll be interesting to see happen. And in my world, we're busy working as so-called experts on the military, the law of armed conflict in space. And a lot of us have formed a marvelous, oh yes, we've formed a marvelous entity that is working on this called the WUMRA Manual in several different universities and government agencies and so forth, trying to figure out what precisely are the rules when there is an armed conflict, and how many of the space law rules continue to live on for the benefit of everyone, and how can we avoid a collision, a conflict in space by more carefully understanding what the terms are right now as states practice it. So that's it. But in general, I caution very strongly against picking up a book and reading someone's view about space and saying, well, that must be it. No, it's not. But so there you go. That's your magical world of space law.
Well, and for those who have watched today and they can't get enough of it, there's an LLM program at Nebraska that they could join and be part of potentially, right?
No, that's true. And I have students from all over the world in it. And of course, the glorious thing about that is that for online non-resident students, it's always been virtual. And now we all know all the things you can do virtually that you don't need to travel to Hawaii to do. That conference in Hawaii just is so important, right? This experience is gonna change a lot. And so yes, the online program at Nebraska is there for people interested in this. And there's also a number of space conferences now that you can join for free. Nebraska's 14th annual DC Space Law Conference comes up in October. You can post that as well. That's free to attend as well. And yes, this time, as I'm experiencing, for all those of you that have kids, I question whether there will be school off days during snow ever again as a legacy of this online experience. But who knows? Anyway, it's been
as a North Dakotan. As a North Dakotan, that hurts me because we always could get 5 days off in the middle of winter. So that's
I know. It'll be sad. It'll be sad.
Well, Professor Beard, thank you so much for presenting today on space law. I thought it was just a fascinating discussion and appreciate all your time on this. We'll put up information if they have any questions when they're watching the on-demand version. We'll put in your email for that, and we'll try to get the slide deck for those who want to look through the slide deck if they need to. And thank you so much. I won't take any more of your time, but I will say I have enjoyed buying things online like the space ice cream for some of our CLE registrants. They can get some of that lovely space ice cream, which can be sent through the mail because it's freeze-dried. And we have some NASA t-shirts and stuff like that for those who are watching.
Excellent, excellent.
Got a kick out of buying some stuff on Amazon there. So thank you so much, and we'll talk soon. Hoya Satsa.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.